Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to our swing state analysis series. And you're going to be wondering why I am centered on New Mexico, considering it's truthfully becoming closer to a safe democratic state. Well, if anybody follows people on Twitter or looks deeply into the crosstabs of most polls, or does that because they followed certain election followers on Twitter, or certain YouTubers even, they'll talk about how Trump's numbers among Hispanics are surprisingly good, despite his decline among white voters and in the national electorate overall. And they'll often use it as a reason to believe that Donald Trump has a better shot of flipping New Mexico, or even being super competitive in New Mexico, than conventional wisdom would dictate. Whether this is true or not, I'm not here to talk about. I'm just here to talk about the state, look at what we know about the state, and how we understand the politics of New Mexico. And the truth is, it really is basically a safe democratic state. You've got Santa Fe and Albuquerque, which are pretty left-leaning cities, or at least Democratic leaning in terms of the party, and those two cities basically combine for well over 50% of the population. Well, maybe not well over, but they combine to effectively make New Mexico a very hard state for Republicans to compete in, unless you are well known in the area and are somewhat moderate on certain issues. Hence Gary Johnson and I want to say Susana Martinez, who were governors of New Mexico. Johnson extremely popular as a Republican, so much so that people remembered his name rather than his party identification and voted en masse for him to take over a Senate seat as a Libertarian. He didn't win. I don't even think he got 20%, but he got like 18%, which is still extremely good, especially for a third-party bid in a Senate race. Now, a lot of that could be attributed to the fact that the Republicans ran a very lackluster candidate that year, and that Johnson was siphoning votes away from the Republican. But a lot of it is also, just him being popular. He almost netted 10% in the 2016 presidential election. It's going to be interesting to see where his share of the vote goes in 2020. As in, the people who voted for Johnson, who they're going to vote for in 2020. But if we were to use conventional wisdom and look at who the Libertarians are closest to, you'd have to say that the Libertarians have historically been a bit of an offshoot of the Republican Party in a lot of ways. A lot of former Republicans have run as Libertarians, much more than former Democrats, and that would indicate that people who are inclined to vote for a Libertarian are a little bit more Republican overall than, say, the general electorate. So wisdom would dictate that most of those voters are going to go for Donald Trump in 2020. A few dedicated will vote for Joe Jorgensen, who is a reasonable candidate and is actually probably the closest thing to an actual Libertarian that the party has nominated, I want to say, since since the 90s probably, and probably since its early days, where they nominated one of the Koch brothers as well as Ron Paul. But I'll leave that up for debate in the comments below. Speaking of the comments below, if you're not already, likes, comments, subscriptions, they really do help this channel grow. We've somehow crossed 430 subscribers since I last talked about it, and that's pretty good. I'd love to see 500 at some point in the near future, but whatever. Back to New Mexico, and the land of enchantment. And by the way, I've been to New Mexico. Absolutely beautiful state. Just, if you have the chance, go to New Mexico. It's well worth it. So there are 3 congressional districts up for grabs in the state. 2 of them are basically safe Democratic. One of those 2 is less safe, but it would be difficult for a Republican to actually snag it, because that district is up in this area and it has Santa Fe. The other district is centered around Albuquerque, and then the other district, the 3rd district, I think it's actually technically the 2nd, but the 3rd district I'm talking about is the southern part of the state, and it is currently represented by a Democrat, Representative Torres Small. I'm not going to attempt to say her first name because I will likely mispronounce it. But she only won in 2018 during a Democratic wave year, and she won very narrowly. And the partisanship of her seat it's a little bit more red-leaning than the rest of the state as a whole, and probably the nation as a whole. Her narrow victory probably isn't an indication for the future of that seat, and she will have a tougher than normal re-election bid this year, but, incumbents generally have an advantage, so it should still be a very competitive race. And she certainly has a good chance of keeping that seat. We'll see what happens. I really don't expect this state to be extremely competitive. I would expect within 15%, but under 10 is probably a little unlikely, and under 5 is very unlikely. And I could, if the crosstabs are to be believed rather than the top line results because of weighting and other statistical practices that are used and are generally well respected, just I have disagreements on how they're being used. If those crosstab numbers showing Trump doing better than he should among Hispanic voters is anything to be believed, and if those reports are true, could it be competitive? Yeah, New Mexico could be competitive, but that's also in the same breath as saying, yeah, Texas, another state we're going to look at, Texas is going to be competitive. I don't really trust a lot of the figures coming out of Texas and Georgia, simply because they're not weighting based off of the right thing. They're not weighting based off of what the electorate is going to be expected to be. And I'll talk about that more when we get to Texas. I've already talked a little bit about Georgia, and quite a lot about Georgia, from the double-barrel Senate race to doing a swing state analysis on that, on Georgia, where I kind of talked about how it's a very inelastic state, and especially in the Deep South and the Sun Belt, you have to be careful when weighting based off of census data rather than a turnout model, because if you're weighting based off of census data, you're going to get far fewer whites and far more young people than are actually going to vote in the election. As a general rule of thumb, electorates, even in presidential general election years, tend to be older and whiter than the population as a whole. However, in some states, this is especially pronounced. Texas and Georgia are great examples of this. Texas is actually majority minority. And again, I'll talk about it more when we get to Texas, but by that logic, it should vote Democratic every single time, but everybody knows that until recently, it was basically a safe Republican state. And like I said, I'll talk about that more when we get to Texas, but with New Mexico, the effect is a little less pronounced, and there's a higher proportion of Democratic voters as a whole in the state. It's just because there's two not large cities, but large cities for the state within its borders that basically control the state as a whole. And the best way to explain that is you go outside of Santa Fe, you go outside of Albuquerque, and I think one other, which are contained within about 3-ish counties. There's a lot of concern over a law that a governor had signed restricting firearms fairly heavily, considering the state and its history regarding firearms laws, which had been fairly lax, actually. And out of the, I want to say 33 counties, 30 of them said, we're not enforcing this crap. And as you can see, well, a lot more than 3 counties voted Democratic in 2016, and that's likely going to hold true in 2020, but it does indicate that the state is fairly moderate in many regards, similar to Arizona, which we started this series off with, and discussing how Arizona kind of has its own political culture where moderates are favored over radicals. One of the reasons why both Flake and McCain were extremely popular senators there, and why Kyrsten Sinema was able to win in 2018, in addition to it being a Democratic wave year, is because Kyrsten Sinema is fairly moderate. But, of course, there's always going to be an exception to the rule. And these states will try to elect the most moderate person available. And New Mexico, a little bit less so, but again, that's partially because of for the state, large urban centers of Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Again, they're not gigantic like, say, a Dallas or a Houston are. But in comparison to the population of the rest of New Mexico, yeah, they're definitely large. So that's my take on New Mexico. Probably going to vote Democratic. Probably going to be a little over 10%. Maybe over 15%. But I am skeptical of the information that some people are using to point to the state's competitiveness in the general election. So, anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.